how many people in here, by show of hands, either operate an oyster farm or plan to operate one in the near future? How many of you guys sat down with someone before you started and said, will I make any money other than your spouse or significant other? And actually maybe wrote a business plan? All right, that's more hands than I normally get. So what I do in Maryland is I help people who are interested in starting oyster farms, fish farms, or whatever, kind of write their business plans, and I give them the kick in the butt real questions to make them think real hard. Everyone loves the thought of growing oysters, but not everybody can make money at growing oysters. So you really got to think about it and come at it from a sound financial decision, not an emotional decision. And the reason I said your heavy, sharp rock farm is I was in North Carolina for a talk a couple years ago. One of the growers said, face it, we're growing heavy, sharp rocks. If you don't have tough hands or gloves or a strong back, this is probably not the business for you. So with that, I'll get started. So the first question I ask people is, how much money do you need to make for this to be worth your while? I get $1 million a year, which is not really realistic, or as long as I break even. Too much work just to break even, so I get this view. It's like, what, we got, what, huh? I hadn't thought about that part. So how many of you have an uncle named Bill Gates? All right, so how are you going to fund your how are you going to fund it? This is an expensive thing. So most people say, well, let's go borrow some money. But did you really sit down and think, how is that going to affect my farm over the long term? So most conventional lenders are not really familiar with aquaculture. So as a result, you get that. How many experienced this when they went and tried to talk to a bank about getting some money? All right, I know there's more than just the one guy because there's a lot of oyster farms in here, and Bill Gates is not related to any of you all. Oh, so I got to hold it. Sorry about that. So some folks just didn't want to raise their hand. So they don't like the risk involved. They don't like how long it takes you to grow oysters. Well, at least in Maryland, because you guys have like super oysters down here that grow in like 3 days. Or they've been burned by aquaculture loans in the past. And speaking of survival, so all my stuff is Chesapeake Bay. I was talking to Ricky outside, and if our growers had your warm water for that amount of time, man, it'd be it changes the economics of the farm completely. So a lot of times you might have to knock on a few doors. Without lenders, many aquaculture operations would not be around. Lambda took a chance on these guys. Worked out pretty good. You know, they had some rough times in the beginning, but then it got better. So you need to think about how debt is going to affect your business over time. So much like Leslie's talk, I'm working on my dissertation evaluating the effects of different loan programs on Maryland oyster farms. So thank you, Leslie, for describing how the simulation software works, so I don't have to do that. So I ran my simulations 5,000 times. I did on a 500,000 oyster per year, 1 million, 2 million, 2.5 million oysters per year is what you're trying to achieve in Virginia-style bottom stack cages. So these are some of the cages from my Honga oyster farm from one of my growers. And I assumed 24 months to market. You guys are like half that. You know, I wish we had that, but we don't. So keep in mind that these are based on Maryland assumptions. All your farms are going to be different. Some other assumptions, I assumed a sales price of 35 to 60 cents. The mean was 41. I expected 50% survival is what I predicted everything on. And you guys apparently are doing much better than that, according to the presentations. But, you know, it doesn't work that way every year. You know, Leslie talked about hurricanes. Luckily, we don't have as big a threat of hurricanes as you guys do, but I put in the Mother Nature factor. So you thought you're going to get 50% every year, but every time and every year you ran into simulation, it changed between 35 to 125% of that. So it changed every year. You never got exactly what you thought. We're using disease-resistant triploid oysters from the Horn Point hatchery for $17 a thousand for 5 to 10 millimeter spat, selling them in 100-count boxes. Every farm's 5 acres. We pay a little bit better than some other folks. We pay $12.50 an hour because I said minimum wage, and my grower said, nobody does this for minimum wage. I can't get anybody to work, much less for minimum wage. We assumed either an owner's salary, so you get to pay yourself, or a farm manager if you don't want to pay yourself for $20 an hour. Labor is really hard to come up with, so I based my estimates on what Virginia reported in one of their reports. Everything's before taxes. I looked at whether or not we paid ourselves and if we paid labor, and everything went to the half-shell market. So we borrowed some money. We took out 3 loans. First one to get started, everything has a 6-year term at 7% interest. You can see the different loan amounts, and in my farms they were used for equipment to get started and for seed to get started every year, because that's what one of our other loan programs, all you can use it for. You can't buy a boat, but you can do anything for it. But keep in mind, every farm is different. Different growing conditions, every year is different. Every grower is different. Their management techniques, do you flip them once a day? Do you flip your bags twice a week? Do you never flip your bags? Everything's a little bit different. And thank goodness you guys are starting to look at how much it costs you to flip your bags and figure out if that is worth it. So every assumptions are different. We go change one thing in my model and everything comes out different. So just think about the trends, not necessarily the actual numbers. So a $500,000 or 500,000 oyster per year farm in Maryland, the yearly profit over a 10-year period average, if you paid for it yourself, you lost $39,000 per year on average. If you borrowed money, you lost a whopping $43,000 a year. And when I say have a percent fail, what I did was I also calculated the net present value, which is, easiest way to explain that is the lottery says it's worth $800 million. But if you take the payout right now, you only get $600 million. So that's like the net present value of that stream of money. I also calculated the internal rate of return. So if it had a negative internal rate of return and a negative net present value, I considered it a failed operation, because you want to make money. You don't want to do all this to lose money. 1 million oysters, 22 and 25% of them failed, respectively. You got up to 2 million oyster level, everything had a positive net present value and a positive internal rate of return. And obviously, the more oysters you sell, the more money you make. So I also looked at, and I did this on accounting profit. So I did not consider depreciation. I did not consider opportunity costs. Because how many of you new farmers in the first 2 or 3 years of your business give a flying flip about depreciation? 1 or 2. In the long term, that makes a difference. But when you're just trying to get started, you're worried about that cash coming in, that cash going out, so that you can get your farm going. So I looked at the payback period. And that's how long it takes you to get that initial investment and get paid for, get back to that even dollar amount for everything you put in before you start seeing your bank account grow. So in the smaller farms, it took longer than the 10 years. So that's, Maryland, that small farm with my set of assumptions just doesn't look real good. For 1 million oysters, the average was 6 years for self-funded, if you paid with Uncle Bill, not this Bill. And then if you borrowed money, it was 7. More oysters, more money, less time to pay everything back. But it ranged, even with the 1 million, it ranged from 3 years if everything went perfect to over 10 years. So it depends on how much you're growing. Heard a lot of talk about labor this morning. If you think about labor in my farms based on those Virginia assumptions, for a 500,000 oyster per year farm, labor was over 75% of your total cost over a 10-year period. Even at 2 million oysters, it was over 60% of your total cost for a 10-year period. So labor is your biggest cost, and you need to figure out what ways that you can best use that labor to increase your production in your farm. So let's say we got rid of some labor. So we're going to scrape by with that 500,000 one and only figure out 50% of the labor. So we don't hire as many folks. We do a lot more work ourselves. It did better. We made $18,000. If we paid everyone $12.50 an hour and just didn't take any labor or any salary for ourselves, it was only $7,000 average. So that paid employee has a big part of it. But if you're working your employees really hard and you're trying to make money, gets going early in the years, it's probably best not to take a salary, so have some combination of that. I have one grower that tells me, I've been in this business for 7 years. I have not taken a salary from my oyster operation yet. Pay my employees, but I don't take a salary from it to help the farm get going. We also saw economies of scale. So that's the bigger you are, the cheaper it gets to grow those oysters. So at 500,000, it was costing 55 cents an oyster. You know, that's right about the selling price or in the ballpark. If you're breaking even, too much work. If you're producing 2.5 million, it was down 20 cents an oyster or so. So you get a lot more margin in there. So for fun, I said, Bill and Rusty tell me they grow oysters a lot faster down here. Let's see what happens. My original model I had, I think 25% of your oysters were ready in the first year, you know, another 50% in year 2, and everything was ready by year 3. So this one I put 75% of your product was ready in 1 year. And the rest was ready in 2 years. So by year 3, you were reaching that full steady state of production. For that 500,000 oyster farm, it made a huge difference. So you went from losing $39,000, $40,000 a year. You know, you're making $20,000 to $16,000 or $16,000 to $20,000 over a 10-year period. Your internal rate of return, you know, 16 to 20%. That's a pretty good investment. If you're going to Shark Tank and you're trying to pitch these guys to invest in your company, and you say, over a 10-year period, I'm going to get a 20% rate of return, you get their attention. So they're paying attention and they might be willing to invest in your farm. So in summary, you can make a profit doing this, but you got to be really careful. It depends on how many oysters you want to make or produce. Larger production scales have a better chance of success just because you're selling more oysters. But as Skid Row at East Coast Shellfish Growers says, you can learn just as much from killing 10,000 as you can from killing 1 million. So, you know, practice a little bit before you go invest all that money. Do you have to pay your employees? A lot of you might say, oh, I'll just do an independent contractor, issue them a 1099. The IRS has some very specific rules on that. You got to be very careful that you don't get in trouble doing that. Do you have to borrow money? Well, if you have Uncle Bill Gates, talk to Uncle Bill Gates. You know, free money is good money. It helps. If you have to borrow money, it's going to impact your operation over the long term for paying those loans back. Think about your interest rate. Lower interest rate makes it have less of an impact. You may have heard about our program in Maryland that blows everything out of the water. You should get one here. I'd be glad to talk about it afterwards. Or if you'd like to move to Maryland, I can tell you where to set a good farm and can help you with some financing. And remember, all operations are different. What you get will be different than my model. It'll be different from year to year. It'll be different from your model every year. I used to joke when I gave these presentations about Matt's magical oyster farm because my oysters grow perfect every single time I know what I'm going to get. But in the real world, it just doesn't happen like that. So use models and these things as a guide, but keep in mind, things are going to change. It's not going to work out. And think about how using that money is going to impact you over a long period of time. If you're not going to be able to get to your goals, even though you borrow that money, think about something else or a different investment. So with that, good luck to you. I'd be glad to take any questions. And I apologize for the Revenge of the Nerds, but it's Bill's fault. He caught me on an 80s week. There's a question back here. So he asked if these were double stack bottom cages, if they were ever brought up to be tumbled. I'm assuming that that's included in the labor cost in Virginia because they talked about, the only thing I didn't know if they included in their labor was if they had admin folks in the office doing paperwork and all that stuff, but it was all the labor that was involved in the farm. So the question was, when I get my dissertation defended, can you have a copy of my super fancy pants spreadsheet that I did this with? We'll see. I don't see a problem with it, but I used a program called At Risk, and mine is not as pretty as Leslie's. I'm sorry. So if you don't have that program, it won't really work. But if you could buy that program, and I don't remember how much it costs because I got a university credit card to pay for it. So, yeah, but I can make that available. My dissertation defense is on Friday, so sometime in the next couple months, I'll be able to figure out how to spread this spreadsheet around.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.